And I'm hitting the timer on my end, so I know where we're at. So like some of you end of life doulas, when I first became, I gotta get rid of this. When I first became an end of life doula, I was not well versed in grief at all. I got a little bit of it in doula training, but not nearly enough. And then when I began volunteering at Shalom, I realized that dealing in grief and working with people who are going through bereavement is actually much more of the task that we do than often than the time spent with people who are dying. So I felt like that was an awesome responsibility that I was pretty unprepared to do. So over the past 18 months, I've actually done 2 different in extensive grief training workshops. One was a day-long one that I know a couple of you have done, working with grief, loss, and mourning, and it mostly designed for counselors and therapists, but I got a lot out of that one. The second was the 12-week in-depth David Kessler course that Nina referred to. And just a little self-disclosure here right now, while I am now a certified grief educator through the David Kessler program, I don't consider myself an expert at all. In fact, I'm sort of drowning in information. And so I'm actually really grateful for this opportunity to cull through all of that information, hopefully funnel it into what's really usable for us and share it with you and reinforce my own learning along the way. And you get to decide what's useful for you, just like with all learning. I hope to provide kind of a buffet, and you pick and choose what's going to be useful and what you might want to save for later, because it might be useful later. I also know, just on this screen and others who will join, lots of us have done extensive grief training. And so please, please add your expertise so we can learn from each other as we go. The first 2 months are going to be specifically just general information about grief. Then we'll get into some practical, and we'll practice some things along the way too. So tonight it's going to be about types of grief, timelines, and tasks. It's our tea night. We probably should have met on a different night of the week, maybe a Tuesday or a Thursday, but we're all here. So, but before we get to that, Rhonda speaks of it as bereavement. Mostly I'm going to refer to it as grief work. So, and I want to just define the words a little bit, and I don't want this to be a semantic discussion. I don't want to go off in that direction. So it's not a discussion. I'm going to tell you this, and then we're going to move on, just to be clear. Bereavement is the state of having suffered a loss. It's a noun. You're in a state of bereavement. Bereaved people have experienced that loss. And in this case, bereaved is an adjective describing the people. Grief or grieving is the process of experiencing that loss. It includes all of the psychological, behavioral, social, emotional, physical, familial, all of those reactions to a loss. So, and in most cases, for most of us, and for most of the people we work with, grieving is a verb. And it actually, there's some action to it that happens. It's sometimes internal, sometimes external, but it's a verb. So, okay, I know some of you have received the handout. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. We'll make sure, Rhonda will make sure you get it. So, hold on for a sec. Okay, we're gonna go over the types of grief, and that's the first page in the handout. Rhonda's gonna screen share with us that list. What I'd like you to do as we go through that list is imagine examples that you have of that. That's the handout. Rhonda, do you have the screen share that the PowerPoint?
Yep, sorry, I thought that's what you were looking for. Yep, I'll put that up.
Oh, PowerPoint. They've got the handout, so we don't need that on the screen. What I want you to do, however, is think about, reflect on your own grief or grief of people you know, people you've worked with, patients you've worked with, families you've worked with. And when we're done going through these types, I want to have us all discuss and share some examples. So we'll quickly go through it, and I'm just going to start and you can find it or not. Does everybody have the handout? Maybe we don't even need it. No, doesn't look like everybody does. Okay, so the first, and I want to say one other thing about the types of grief. This is all to inform us. It's not, we're not trying to analyze what type of grief someone's in so we can tell them about it. It's about, can you put it on slideshow now? Just the first slide on slide. Thank you. We are there. All right, teamwork. So delayed grief, it doesn't always need a lot of explanation, but it's often our bodies or our life situation is not in a place where we can experience the grief that we need to experience. If I'm experiencing cancer and my mom dies during that time, my grief might be delayed. In fact, it will likely be delayed because my body's not going to be able to handle it. Sometimes huge weather catastrophes like the tornado that went through Kentucky 2 weeks ago will cause enormous delayed grief. People don't have the capacity to grieve when they're dealing with huge tragedies like that. Disenfranchised grief is the grief that gets minimized kind of by everybody else. An animal loss is an example. That we know how difficult that is for people when their pets die, and for some folks that it's just not a loss that they understand. So people feel a little bit ignored, or their grief gets disenfranchised. And then the ambiguous grief that you were talking about, I read the article written by the woman. My son sent it to me, and we are all in the middle of ambiguous grief right now because of COVID, and I know that's what she writes about as well. But one that we do run into is miscarriage. The enormity of grief with miscarriage is often ignored by people, and it's ambiguous because, well, it's ambiguous. It's hard to explain ambiguous. There are all kinds of issues around miscarriage that happen for folks, and so I know some of you can speak to that better than I can. The inconclusive grief is when there is no body. Sometimes I think we have inconclusive grief through COVID because of not being able to actually witness the person who's dying, not being able to be anywhere near them during that time. But an example that someone in one of my classes talked about was their family dog was stolen. And they never saw the dog again. No one ever solved what happened. The grief was real, and the mystery of it stayed alive for them. So it was a little bit of, we wonder what happened, and maybe this happened, and it just stayed in the family for a long time. So complicated grief, lots of emotions involved. If we think about grief, the metaphor that David Kessler likes to use is that grief is a river. It keeps flowing, and just like any river, debris and branches will fall into the river as it moves through, and depending on the debris, there will be a small ripple, or there will be a huge ripple, or sometimes it gets blocked. So the complicated grief has lots more debris in that river of grief. collective and public grief. It's the 9/11 grief. It's it's this past year or two, or perhaps three, that we've all been through. It's in Minneapolis, it's the George Floyd shooting. There's the collective grief that's there and known about. Traumatic grief, the one I think about, the trauma gets confused, or the trauma just gets combined with the grief. A traffic accident, a car accident where people are killed, the trauma of the accident or the trauma around the reporting. So a violent death of any kind is going to have trauma with it and give us traumatic grief that we might be dealing with. And the important piece there to remember is to not put the person back through the trauma. Try to learn what's triggering that trauma for them, so that you allow them to grieve without re-traumatizing them. And then masked grief is one we see. We see it even in people who are experiencing anticipatory grief. It's often anger. Sometimes it shows up as fear, but often there's anger there. Sometimes in families, the mass grief shows up as greed, as people argue over who gets what. And recognizing that that's grief is tough for us. Anticipatory grief, we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, but that's the one we all, as doulas in a hospice program, we're dealing with anticipatory grief all the time. Cumulative grief, a person experiences a series of losses during a very short period of time. And one of the important pieces that David Kessler talks about is you can't actually grieve more than one person at a time. So he says, if you lost, I have nieces and nephews who lost my sister died of COVID, her husband died of COVID within a 6-month period. So these 5 nieces and nephews lost their parents in 6 months. He said, you don't grieve your parents, you grieve your mom. And you say even, Dad, I'm going to grieve you tomorrow. I'll set aside time to spend with you tomorrow, but right now I need to focus on Mom. And you otherwise it can't complete, it can't be real. So I'm passing that on. And then there's secondary loss. When someone dies who you're close to, sometimes you lose the people they were close to. So you have a secondary loss in there. If people who've experienced the loss of a child lose that child's friends very often, or the family members that they knew that were family of the child's friends. And or sometimes if you have a child that dies, you lose everybody else's children because people are afraid to talk about their children with you because they don't want to bring up your grief. So that's a secondary loss. So at the bottom of the handout, I talk about the individual grief is as individual as fingerprints, and there's no wrong or right way to grieve. There's only your way to grieve. And then the thing David Kessler would say often is, if you've seen one person in grief, you've seen one person in grief. So I want to come back to you now. What examples struck you? What the types of grief? Who's got examples they're willing and able to share? Either your own or someone you've worked with.
One.
Go ahead, Judy. Judy with an I.
I was going to say complicated grief. To me, I see this, I've seen it with my husband's and his father. So complicated has a lot to do with what the relationship was before. So that, it's your father, you're supposed to be sad. But if he didn't treat you very well, that's complicated. So, and I think we've all probably seen some of this, there's some complication in that relationship that the dying person had with the surviving family member or loved one. And so, and and then people get all confused because I'm supposed to feel sad because my mother died, or whatever, but I'm feeling relieved that she died. So anyway, I would just say I feel like I've heard those stories.
Yeah. And it's that, to go back to that phrase, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's only your way to grieve. Actually, the addition of complicated grief, I think, sort of belies, it makes you think there must be simple grief. And I don't know that there's simple grief. I think almost always there are complicating factors that come into play. Judy with a Y.
This ambiguous label is very interesting to me. I never thought of that before, but when you described it, I have a friend whose husband died at 39 of brain cancer. And she said to me, I think after he died, she told me this, she said, we were sitting there, everybody was focused on him. He's going to, groups for people who are dying of cancer, and, everybody's focused on him. And she said, what about me? What about me? Nobody was worried about me. She said, this was before he died. She said, I've got 2 kids to raise by myself. Nobody's worried about me. Everyone's just thinking about him. And she was like really pissed off about it. And she couldn't tell anybody at the time because it looked so selfish to say that. But it's really true. The one who's left is the one who suffers. The one who dies is gone. So it was very, poignant when she said that. And now I've got kind of a name for it. I think that's what she was experiencing.
And think about that also as perhaps some masked grief in there. There's anticipatory grief and masked grief. I mean, it doesn't have to have a definition that's a box. Very organic.
Yeah.
Nina, did I see your hand up? Nina G.
Yeah. So 38, 40 years ago, 35 years ago, I had my 4 daughters. 3 of them were stillborn. And the first pregnancy was a pregnancy where I almost died. So there wasn't a place to put that grief. There just wasn't a place. And then on top of that, you keep adding on stillbirths. And so then you have, nobody wants to talk about it. So you have the delayed grief that you don't know what to do with. You have, and I would even say some masked grief with that, because there's anger and there's frustration and there's sadness, and then there's that layering, year, pregnancy after pregnancy after pregnancy. And I think that that what was really interesting for me was, as I was making memorials for other people that were losing children, and this is go forward 40 years, all of a sudden I realized I had never honored my own daughters. And so for me to make them memorials ended up, I had no idea that I had that much wailing to do, that there was that much grief that was still there. So it's interesting.
Thank you, Nina, for that vulnerable sharing.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else who wants to speak to this? Hey, I was born with I have 4 older siblings, now 3. And there was a 9-year gap before I was born between me and my closest sibling, and my mother had 2 stillborn children and a miscarriage, but I have 2 stillborn brothers. No, one lived for 3 days. So it was one of each. And that, that never affected me. at all, I thought, until I was in my 40s and I went to visit their grave for the first time ever. And I was blown away with grief, just blown away. And my 16-year-old son was with, and he said, "Mom, why are you so sad?" And I said, "I can't explain why I'm so sad. I just have to accept that I am this sad." You know, I didn't label the grief, but it certainly has some ambiguity to it, you know, and I might not exist had they lived, that kind of thing. So. Okay, anyone want to add? Thank you, Amy. Agnes.
This is something where I'm like, I think that there's, I mean, of course, multiple definitions that could be attached, but I'm not sure about one of them. But when I was a junior in high school, I had transferred to a new school. And in that first winter, one of my classmates who was in like my main class there, which was a writing class, her dad and two of her siblings were on a vacation, and her dad was a pilot. And so they had flown a private jet, and when they were coming back, they were lost for like weeks. So definitely traumatic. And what I'm kind of curious to think or hear more about is, can something be cumulative grief when you lose multiple people at once and not out over a short period of time?
Yes. Cumulative grief as well. Yeah. I'm sorry, that text came through. I can't do anything about it at this point in time. But thank you for sharing that. And I didn't tell you this part, but there's going to be homework at the end of this. And I'm really, really aware that when you give adults homework, it's a crapshoot. Some will do it, some won't. I don't care. I don't care if you do it or not. But the homework, I'll tell you ahead of time, is I'm actually going to ask you to list somewhere between 10 and 20 losses that you've experienced in your life. So these are not just deaths. Deaths will be in there, obviously, but losses. I was surprised when I did it to recognize that, oh, I've got some losses I have never processed through and certainly never healed. And as we work with people who are experiencing grief, our own losses, if we don't heal them, are going to show up for us. So I'll remind you of that homework later too, but you can do what you want with it. Okay, thank you for sharing all of those examples. Now we're going to move to the timeline of grief. So the next slide, Rhonda. And while we know there's no exact timeline at all, I think it's helpful to understand these 4 stages so we can kind of know where a person is. So that anticipatory grief is often what we deal with as doulas, and what with Nina A's help and the concierge calls and the whole revamping of the bereavement program, it's what we're exploring right now in Shalom Hospice. It's helping us to gauge how much grief is a family already experiencing, and perhaps predict how much they might experience. So that just exploring that whole anticipatory grief. I think our roles as doulas or people who are involved at all in hospice is to let people know that's normal. Anticipatory grief is normal, or maybe a better word is common. Normal is a weird word. Know what's normal and what isn't, but it's common, anticipatory grief. The acute grief is when death has just happened and the person who's grieving is absolutely swamped. They're in shock. Again, it's really common for them to be in that place, to not be able to make decisions, or to go into hyper decision-making mode and make every decision there is, or somewhere in between along that continuum. The important part for those of us who are working with them is to recognize when they're starting to come out of that stage. And usually it'll sound something like, oh, I'm finally beginning to catch my breath. It's just been unbelievable. Or finally, I feel like I'm getting my feet on the ground again. You know, it's like, or I can see straight again, or just, it's something, it's a little bit of normal that's starting to return, and they often will express that. So early grief, and I actually loved the timeline on this. Early grief is 2 years, easily 2 years, with probably that being the minimum. And again, in early grief, there are people who will experience the grief from an emotional, psychological, physical side. And there will be people who are practical grievers, and they will spend that time taking care of whatever kind of business needed to be taken care of during that time. They're still grieving, they've just got really different approaches to it. I loved actually the last one, the mature grief or the integrated grief, the rest of one's life. You know, we grieve for the rest of our lives. And any of us who've had losses that are 20 plus years older, or as Nina described with the miscarriages, knows that. I actually was going through this afternoon, and there's 6 of us living in this house, 3 couples, and 2 of my dear friends are here. And I was going through this afternoon, and because they've had huge losses in their life, I said, I think you guys might be interested in these phases here that go on, or these stages. And as soon as I said acute grief, my one friend started telling the story of when her dad died 30 years ago. And it was really clear to me, we need to listen to this story because it's still very alive for her. She, at her stage of mature integrated grief, it's still a really important story to tell. And while I knew the story, my other friend didn't. So she had a new person to be able to tell that to. So it was a great example of how we live with that grief forever. So responses to this, reactions to this, your own experience with this. Would you like to add anything to this timeline? Enrich it?
It is interesting that the 2-year number, because so often people think it's 1 year. And it's even reinforced, you know, unintentionally by our bereavement calls, which we make the last call, and they're officially done with the hospice bereavement support after 13 months. So it's like kind of unintentionally, you know, strengthening that 1 year thing, which is so like hurtful to people if, you know, if they don't feel finished, and people are saying, well, it's been a year, you know, like, get over it. I mean, obviously I'm very careful not to say anything like that, but it's still structurally, it's there. We're calling them at a year, we're cutting off service, you know, it's kind of like, you should be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe telling them, we don't expect you to be done.
Yeah.
We expect that you'll be grieving this forever,
Mm-hmm.
in different ways. The support, however, is being scaled back.
Right, right.
Unless you want it some more, you can get some more. But for most people, usually, I mean, I don't know, this is the wisdom of Medicare.
Actually, I'll look this up, but David Kessler told a story about what was going on in Congress during the time that they were debating the Medicare law. And that 13-month came out of somewhere really weird. Agnes, do you know this story? You're shaking
No,
your-
I don't. I've just heard a little bit about it, but yeah.
So it's like there's no wisdom in it. It was sort of pulled in for some strange political reason.
And you can know that in bereavement, you can extend it beyond the 13 months. If the person wants it and you are like, yeah, you would write up a note saying, we're going to keep going.
But then it's a place for therapy. I mean, they don't need to be using us. They need to be going at some point with a more conventional treatment that some people need and most people don't probably need, but some people do. They should get a therapist. I mean, I was making that one call, Rhonda, you remember, to this guy like every 3 weeks because he said he would like me to, but in the end, it was like, this is a case for your therapist. You know, I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained that way. And if you're having trouble, you know, coping with your grief, at some point you should be having a more, you know, a therapeutic form of help instead of this.
And I think the distinction is if you're having trouble coping with your grief, you might need a therapist. If the timeline just doesn't match your particular progress, I think that's different. But Rhonda, I will tell you, I didn't know that we could extend it. So I'm curious. I'm happy to hear that,
Most
actually.
people we want to, because we have only so much capacity, we want to stabilize, we want to get them steady on their feet, to be able to put one foot in front of the other and be able to do this. And most people can, so I read. Most people have what they need inside them to move through their grief. We're here to support, steady, go. And you can always come back if you need to too. Give us a call if you need a little extra. That's okay too. And in fact, we want that because we're supposed to do individualized grief plans. Bereavement plans.
I'm actually gonna keep, oh, go ahead, Corey. I will do
Oh,
one
I
more.
was just gonna say, therapy is one avenue. It's not, I think, the only. I think a lot of these feelings are stuck in our body, and I think there's a lot of other holistic modalities in today's world to help physically move what needs to be moved. I also found the simplicity of a woman I spoke to yesterday who continuously said she was sad, she was sad, she was sad. And we talked about finding beauty in the present moment. Now, mind you, I'm completely a beginner at this and just kind of winging it, but she's really absorbing whatever our conversations have become. And she really appreciated hearing the simplicity of things. So I think, I don't know, this stuff is not easy, but sometimes it can just, I know, what is it? It's not simple, but it's easy. It's just, so she's also in Florida right now. And she observed Nina do a ritual at the memorial. So we talked about just going to the water and telling a story about her father, or throwing a rock in, or creating some kind of connection with nature. And she was like overly joyed at my random ideas with no training. So
Your random great ideas.
Okay.
A little judgment in there. Okay, so I want to move on just because of time on the 4 tasks of grief. So one more. I'm not even sure if we need that. If we need the slide, Rhonda. To accept the reality of the loss. So this is the tasks of the person who is actively grieving, accepting the reality of the loss. And usually that means the mourner, the person who is bereaved, has to talk about the loss. They have to talk about the death. They might have to talk about the body. They might have to talk about the funeral, and they might have to do that multiple times because we absolutely have to have somebody who will witness that for us. And I think that's one of the really important roles we play after a death, is that we are witnesses to what people are going through before, during, and after a loved one dies. So, and then to experience the pain, there is actual pain in grief, and the pain has to be experienced at some point. We have to trust the people we're working with, that their body knows when they're ready to experience that pain. Might be this month, it might be in 6 months, it might be in 2 years, it might be in 35 years. But it's still important it's okay for it to hurt. It's not comfortable for it to hurt, but it's okay for it to hurt. And you can tell me about the hurt and I will witness it, remembering it's not my job to fix it ever. I can't fix it. part of that hurt is longing for the person, or incredible sadness over this loss, and the sadness that's just overwhelming and won't be diminished. Those are really painful places to be, really painful. So then the other two tasks: to adjust to the environment without the deceased. And this is where lots of other losses come in. You know, in particular, we're often working with people who are married for a long time, and one of the spouses dies. And you play a role in your marriage. You have certain tasks that you always do, and now those tasks don't get done, or they have to get done by somebody else. And so that there's a secondary loss. I've lost the person who did the cooking, or I've lost the person who managed the car stuff, those kinds of things. Those of us who lost our parents, you know, that there's the secondary loss in that is that they're the only people on earth who knew me my entire life. That kind of loss, and the consciousness that comes through. And you got to adjust to that over and over again. And I can't call mom for that recipe like I thought I would be able to. And then that emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. Mourners often feel a little disloyal to, I'm getting on with my life, but I feel a little bad about that because they're gone and I'm getting on with my life. David Kessler's words, which I loved, were we need to encourage people to grieve fully and live fully at the same time. So when a person adapts to a loss, grief isn't over at all. It finds a different place in our lives. For a couple of minutes, does anybody want to speak to any of this? Nina.
I would like to spin it a little bit differently. Just had a phone call with someone whose mother had died just before Christmas, and we talked really just about these four bullet points, and she was fully in acceptance of the reality. She was on board, grateful that her mom had died. We talked about that visceral grief that sometimes hits, where there's keening or the sobbing or the wailing, and she had been experiencing that over several years, because it had been about 5 years that her mom had been declining. We talked about that adjustment of the environment also pertains to how do we now work our way into the world in a different way? Where do we find our freedom? Where do we do things differently because either we don't have pressure or we have release or whatever it is that, if it was a parent or a spouse or whatever, there's a shift, and there can be a freedom that comes along with that. That is really beautiful, and to watch people kind of unfold and unfurl in that. And then we talked just very briefly about how now, when she would drive home from work, she would call her mom every night, and she would lose her at this particular spot. And her mom would say, "Are you at that particular spot?" And then she would say, "Yeah, I am." And then she'd get home, she'd get in her driveway, blah, blah, blah. Well, now as she's driving home, she's talking to her mom the whole way. And then she tells her mom, "I'm at the particular spot and I've just driven by." And so she's done that relocation and made it like she's right here right now. And so that was a beautiful segue. Thank you.
Actually, that just makes it all real. Your example is just great. Thank you. Wendy.
Let's see if
Oh yeah, I'm not muted. So when I saw the word relocation, what occurred to me was between 13 and 18, I lost all 6 of my elders. So they all died. And I was able to see and be with and mostly work with the actual bodies of 5 of them. So one was out of the country, so that we couldn't do that. And I am not sure of what Mary Oliver calls my soft mammal self, but my soft mammal self knew then that they were dead in a way that was completely unambiguous. And especially the closer I got to the body, like I got to wash my dad's body and I don't know if I'm unusual, but I think that I'm not. I think there's a lot of people who would never want to do that. But for the people who do, I think I relocated them from the living to the dead without any thought, which didn't mean I didn't have to go through whatever happened after and deal with all the experiences of grief. But I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Agnes.
I'm just kind of thinking about this right now and curious if other people have thought about this, but I'm not even sure how I feel about it for sure, but I listened to or watched a TED Talk a while ago that Nora McInerney gave, and it's titled like "We Don't Move On from Grief, We Move Forward." And so to me, whenever I hear someone talk about moving on in my head now, I'm always just like, we move forward, we move forward. So I'm just like curious about what other people think with that too.
Great. Yeah, those are great words. I'm gonna call on Patricia and then we'll see if
Yeah, well, that's related to what I was going to say, Aggie. The way I would prefer to think about this last one in terms of emotionally relocating is that it's really, for me, it's been a constant redefining of my relationship with my partner, Roy. It's been a long time, and I am still in relationship with him, and I am constantly changing and as I change in terms of that relationship, but his presence in terms of conversations we might have or what he might think about something or how we do a ritual in our family that is connected to a ritual that he brought into our family, for example, it all continues. And so the best advice I got was from my 90-year-old neighbor friend when Roy died, who said, Patricia, people are going to tell you that you're going to get over it. She said, you're never going to get over it, but you will learn to live with it. And that is really true. But it never changes. In April, it will be 14 years since Roy died, and he and I were together for 14 years. And so I will be processing the fact that I am now starting the next year of living with that I have lived without him longer than I lived with him. And that kind of breaks my heart. But I'll figure it out, obviously.
Thank you for your vulnerability as well. And Agnes, I'll change your handout. I'm changing my handout for that one to move forward, not move on that last task. I think that those are really good words. I want to add that it's the gentle curiosity and support that we bring as doulas and hospice volunteers that actually allow people to move through and do some of these tasks. There isn't a do there, but it allow them to move through these tasks. And it's also, I think, our acceptance of how messy it can be. They're not easy tasks. There's no cookie cutter way to do it. It's messy, and I think it's really important for all of us to remember it's not our job to clean up that mess. It's our job very often just to support them as they figure out how to clean up that mess. And sometimes it's our job to be aware of their progress. That was my timer for 45 minutes. Be aware of their progress, and when it's appropriate, point that out to them. You know, we've been working together for 8 months, and I can really see how our conversations have changed. That kind of, rather than say you're doing really well with this, say here's the progress I actually have seen and witnessed. But it's been a privilege to witness, kind of thing. So, wow. We're complete for tonight. I'm going to remind you of that homework, 15 to 20 losses that you experience. Do it if you want. Don't do it if you don't want. But what I gleaned from tonight was the richness of us together talking about grief and what we know and what we don't know and what we want to learn. So thank you.